Have you ever wondered how you could possibly grow your own food without spending every free minute of time in your garden? Or maybe you're dreaming of taking that extended summer vacation without worrying about your crops wilting in the heat or becoming overrun with weeds? If thoughts like these have crossed your mind, then I've got good news for you. It is totally possible to grow a productive garden with minimal upfront labor and very little maintenance along the way. And in this video, you're going to meet some of my students who have done just that. If you're new here, hi, I'm Jared Regier, founder of the Vegetable Academy, where I share the techniques I learned as a market gardener with everyday growers like you so that you can experience the same satisfaction of growing your own food and doing it well. In the last decade, I've grown over 40,000 pounds of food with these two hands, and I haven't done it by working harder, I've done it by working smarter. Now, you may not want to grow that same quantity of food, but you can still use these same small-scale growing techniques to minimize the amount of time and energy that your garden requires. That's why I built the Seed to Table course to help everyday vegetable gardeners grow more food with less effort. Now, it's time to meet our guests today, James and Susan Ensfunk from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. They are two busy professionals who have somehow managed to grow their own food supply for winter, even while taking extended summer holidays.
We're both teachers and we're both working full-time doing that in Saskatoon here. We have gardened on and off throughout our teaching careers, but just recently both of our kids have moved away from home and we've had a little bit more time to put into yard and garden. Most of the time, we're trying to fit it in on weekends and evenings. May and June, we're starting our own seed in the basement and transitioning things outside. And most of that happens sort of around the corners of our work life. In the summer, technically, we'd have more time, but because our kids are living in Southern Ontario and we're in Saskatchewan, we are often gone for a chunk of time during the summer to visit them. And we also enjoy going to the lake with my parents. And so our garden is built around the parameters of us not necessarily spending the whole summer attending to what it needs, but trying to stick it in and around the other things that we're doing for both pleasure and work.
I have two extracurricular activities in spring, which make it trickier. I lead the canoe club at school, so there's training sessions, weekend practices that also then make doing things in the evenings and weekends harder because I'm out with kids canoeing. I'm also organizing an exchange program with Germany. So then usually in mid to later June, I'm gone for a week and a half with those kids. So I'm not around and I tend to do most of the grunt work in the garden.
And then it's school startup during harvest. It's really not ideal.
One thing I really appreciated about James and Susan was their lack of excuses. They have dreams of more serious homesteading in the future, but right now they've got two full-time jobs and a home in the suburbs with a limited amount of time and space. Thankfully, they didn't let these challenges stop them from getting started. Instead, they asked themselves what they could do now, and they began taking deliberate steps to surround themselves with food. Oh, and sorry about the fuzzy faces in these next segments. It's not your device, it's my fault. Didn't press all the right buttons during our live session.
We're on the north end of our city, and right out our backyard is a natural grassland preserve. So we do get wildlife around our property, even though we're living in a city.
That's interesting that you'd have that combination. It's pretty rare to have the wildlife pests of the rural area, but still the limits and confines of growing in an urban environment. Here's a top view of your property closer up. Is there anything we should note here?
Our backyard has a northeast orientation. It's probably not super ideal for our growing conditions. And on the south side, our neighbors have actually fairly large trees. And we had sort of not quite accommodated for the height of those when we were doing our first site plans. So we get more shade than anticipated in our backyard.
This is a view of your backyard here. And your garden location here, you won't be able to tell that maybe from the next photo.
Yeah,
right.
That's the primary one, and then this year we made another one sort of along the end where your mouse there is there.
Yeah. Along the fence line itself, we actually have one bed that goes right along the fence line, which is where we have our raspberries. And then we have right next to the shed, the first two beds are strawberries. And then where you see a massive riot of green is our carrots. And then it eases off towards the other side where we had some onions and potatoes.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to the decision of laying it out in this orientation?
Well, I think when we did the first part of your course, we were looking at which direction the sun was moving across the yard, and we knew we'd get the best sun with the beds going sort of north to south-ish. And so they get sun throughout the day for the most part. And particularly in the center of the bed, it gets quite a bit of sunlight.
So has the 10-foot bed size worked out for you in terms of giving you the right amount of crop quantity for your family? Or do you wish that you would have smaller zones where you could plant a smaller quantity of a crop?
Mostly it's worked really well. Some of them we still split in half when we make one of beets and one of garlic, for example, because then we only use a half bed on each of them.
I think the 10-foot bed is going to give us a better size for the two of us for the kinds of plants that we want to have and the harvests that we need for eating through the year.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to make. The bed size makes sense partially because you're focusing on the pantry garden choice of crops. Like if you had a 10-foot bed of cucumbers, you'd be drowning in cucumbers all summer and it wouldn't be appropriate, but that's not the kinds of things that you're growing. And then the last part of the site orientation was this back zone that you're starting to prep for more growing beds.
Yeah, and we covered it up again because there was still grass in pieces of it and we didn't want to fight the grass, so we just kept it covered. It's a work in progress.
Does this give us an idea of what your other side of the garden was like in that first year when you said you just tarped it?
Yep, same tarp.
So can you tell people the whole process about how you got those beds started with the least labor possible?
Yep, we took a tarp, we unfolded it, we put a bunch of rocks, which we had because this was a very rocky place, and then we did nothing.
For a year. It
Yep.
was awesome.
Yep.
We said, we're learning to garden.
And then was there really nothing under the tarp when you pulled it up? Did it really kill all the grass?
It really, really does. It's great.
And the amount of time in total that the tarp was on, because people always ask, how long does it take until you get a full kill of grass? And that depends on the species of grass you're dealing
Well,
with.
that's the interesting thing. This bed, that's why we left it half covered this year because we started too late last season.
Yeah,
So we
partway
put it
through the summer.
down probably mid-July. So it still grew May and June, and then it wasn't ready in May, June of this year. So it does kind of need the
It was
12.
like 85% ready.
It was so close.
But instead of
there-
like going and trying to get up all of the rhizomes, I got lazy and just put the tarp back down.
If there's an easy path, you can take it sometimes if you got the time on your side.
Yep.
So then that first year, the grass was killed just by covering it from as soon as the ground was exposed in spring till
Till the next year. Yeah.
Yeah, till the next year entirely.
Yep.
So in some climates, that would be 12 months of active killing time. But in our climate, where the ground is frozen solid from mid-November till April, we only have about 6 months of active killing time. So maybe 6 months then it took to kill your lawn with tarping time.
Yep.
Okay. The first place people usually go wrong when planting their garden is crop selection. And the mistake they make is selecting crops that just don't match their lifestyle. For example, if you wanted to travel a lot in the summer, like James and Susan, then it wouldn't make sense to grow a crop like broccolini that requires a harvest every second day, or a crop like radishes that has an incredibly narrow harvest window. If you honestly don't want to spend much time in your garden, then you at least have to be intentional about selecting crops that can handle your absence. Starting with the crop selection, it's remarkable how well you did at just keeping this list simple in the interest of what I assume is freeing yourself from the types of crops that require ongoing maintenance. Was that the main priority that you had in mind when choosing this crop selection, or were there other factors?
It's pretty much making sure that we can make windows of time within the summer for us to be able to be gone. Yeah, it's all about congregating harvest times.
Have you managed to make all of these crops work? I can imagine tomatoes might be giving you some food when you're on the road, peas too.
Yeah, this year the kids were actually home for the first time in 4 summers. So we went on the trip that we were planning in 2020 for our 25th anniversary, on our 29th anniversary. So we were gone for 3 weeks to not visit the kids because we saw the kids for 3.5 months. Well, 3.5 months instead of 2 weeks.
So they ate our strawberries and
They ate a lot of
portion
strawberries.
the raspberries
Yep.
and the peas, but
Mhm.
we had planted those knowing that was probably going to occur, and we still got some of all of them and jam from lots of it. So, but mostly it's built around us being able to do like set it, forget it.
Any modifications you imagine making to this top 10 list going forward?
We do want to experiment a little bit with some greens and probably
squash.
things that so winter squash and greens are two things that we want to experiment with. we figure if we planted things early that we harvested before we had our summer holidays, and then planted things late that we would harvest after we've had our summer holidays, then we could still enjoy some of fresh greens from our own garden. So that's something we'd like to add.
Lettuce could meet that criteria, and you could plant
Yeah.
it again right when you get back before school starts in late August, and you still get fall lettuce. And winter squash would be another good fit. Even though it demands a lot of space, it's incredibly low maintenance, and you could start it in spring and it'll give you some squash in the fall when you're back in town. So now that they've got their top crops in mind, how are they going to grow them? Well, one thing that James and Susan were clear about right from the start was that they had a very limited amount of time to spend on their garden, and they certainly didn't want to waste that time heading in the wrong direction. Instead, they wanted to skip right to the head of the class and start practicing the techniques that were already proven to be effective. Today, we can attribute a lot of their early successes to their willingness to simply follow clear instructions and make long-term investments in their gardening future. Here are a few examples. You've got some indoor seed starting, no greenhouse or anything to mention. You're going straight from indoor seed starting to the outdoor beds. What's that process been like so far? Are you feeling comfortable with the investment in seed starting equipment, or are you wishing that you had just left it out? How's it feeling?
It's really satisfying, and the quality control that you get for how starting up your seedlings just do so much better than starting from seed straight into the ground, which is what we did previously, like buy seeds, throw it in the ground and hope something happens. Whereas this way, you can start. You have more range of seeds that you can use, which is great. It gives you control of that because you don't have to just take whatever the greenhouse close to you is producing. And you can choose your absolutely perfect little seedlings. Some of them aren't perfect, but lots of them are. And then you can pot them up and see how they do. I actually find that whole process really satisfying. You feel so accomplished, and yet, you don't really actually do that much. It's just seeds doing what seeds do, but it's fun.
Yeah.
No, but we follow the instructions of, this is the best grow light that Jared tells us. So
Yeah.
we buy that one, and this is the heat mat, and then we buy a timer, and then it works just like Jared says.
Yeah.
You also tried the soil blocks, which we use as well. And not everyone has positive experiences with soil blocking right out of the gate because it's an acquired skill. You have to learn it.
Well, you got to remember to actually clean the soil blocker instead of trying to do multiple blocks with it, because then it just clumps and that doesn't work. But if you do like all of the steps of the instructions, then it works.
It's funny how that works, hey?
Yeah.
You do it exactly the same, you get the same result. So
the nice thing with having a small operation like ours is like we have one heat mat and like one light station and one timer and one seed stand space. And we can, generally speaking, get through all of the pieces that we need from seed to garden using just that space, because we're not starting a whole pile of seeds. We're starting just a little garden worth of seeds.
Yeah, it does mean that, you can do almost any step within an hour of time.
Which is perfect for us because that's about what we have.
And you commented about how this works because you only are starting a few seeds indoors, but to those watching, I would encourage you still to don't underestimate how many plants you can actually start with a couple of shelves. And the reason you can get away with starting so many plants in the small spaces, because once you get started with this, you realize they're always flowing through. You're starting some in 1 month, and by the time you're ready to start the warm season crops, the others are gone. They're already hardening off outside and your space is open again. So it takes some practice and some getting used to seeing that flow, but there's a lot of potential in just one set of grow lights and a good plan. And then heading outside, you've invested in a mechanical seeder. Tell us about that decision-making process and the experience you've had using it so far. How does it compare to hand planting?
Well, for carrots, it's just a game changer because it was so much easier. That's the only thing I've used it thus far, because of course, when you're planting seedlings, then you don't need the seeder. Mostly it's my experience, I would say, from working with crappy tools and working with good tools, whether that's some of the stuff that I've woodworking or we have one car, mostly Susan drives to work in it because I ride my bike. And so I'll buy a more expensive bicycle than many just because it's more fun to ride something that's light and responsive and not slow and uninspiring. And the joy of using tools that are well built and function well just that's a high priority for me because I like that. So partly that was that question in your decision-making matrix. what are the priorities for you when you're gardening?
Yeah, the priority is we're keeping it simple so that we could take those breaks. They were making upfront investments that we knew we'd use over time. So not being afraid to make an investment in a piece of equipment and prioritizing, like being able to do the learning we need to do now on sort of a smaller scale with the hopes that it will sort of benefit in the long run. So having a long view to what the investment is for, knowing that actually in some ways we have more money than time. We wanted to prioritize like things that would make it like simple and successful without a lot of investment of time. So
Yeah,
those
like
were
daily or weekly investments necessarily.
So that was kind of the things we were thinking through when we made our choices.
And we wanted to grow things we wanted to eat.
Yeah, I can see how an investment like a mechanical seeder, if you're prioritizing instant payback from your garden from 1 year of investment and 1 year of production, a mechanical seeder might think like, well, maybe that's not the best thing.
But they're really expensive carrots.
Road, yeah. But if you're going to use your seeder for 20 years, the seeder probably paid itself back this year already in the amount of time it saved you to seed a bed in 2 minutes.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is like we didn't buy the seeder the first year. We bought it the second year. So the first year we prioritized, making sure we had the drip irrigation and because we
loading row covers and
things that would keep the birds and the insects out, and things for the seeding process. And then it was the next year when we started to look at the broad fork and the mechanical seeder because
the first year we just rototilled everything and you don't need a broad fork then.
Yeah, we do plan on doing more gardening when we retire and hopefully, we'd love to be homestead gardeners, but right now we just had to be realistically pantry gardeners.
But some investments like this, you can think long term and imagine yourselves getting value back from these things for years.
Yeah,
the
exactly.
other thing that's really nice is when you fail on a crop and you only planted half bed or one bed, it's not that much of a loss. So part of it is the investment in learning. How do I use the tools? What tools do we need? And what does that result in?
A couple of other equipment uses. You got some sharp looking trellises there that look familiar. Have you been happy with those so far?
All the things that I build that you have plans for make us look really competent.
It's awesome.
We had peas, I like peas. That was a push against Susan's better judgment, but we still had some peas ripening in August. And I don't recall of a pea season that was longer than maybe 2 or 3 weeks in all of my gardening. So the trellises were really cool.
They go up so nicely, they store so nicely.
Okay, but how do you start all this and then somehow walk away in the middle of summer? Remember, one of James and Susan's top priorities was that they would maintain their freedom to travel throughout the summer months. They didn't want to spend their whole summer vacation tending their garden. And the only way that was going to happen was if they had a plan to automate their irrigation and stop the weeds.
Oh my goodness. Drip irrigation is the difference between success and failure for people who are going to leave their gardens for any period of time because
3 weeks in Ontario and hey, nothing's dead.
Yep. You have weeds, but you still have growing plants. It's awesome.
Well, with ground cover, you don't have that many weeds.
That's true too. Those are the things that make life happy in the garden.
And you'll find in the years to come too, the more years that you can keep your weeds under control in the garden, the longer those trips can be without you coming back with consequences. You've just disturbed a lot of soil in the setup of this garden. So yeah, there are going to be weed seeds that have found themselves on the surface, but the more you keep doing what you're doing here, mulch in the walkways, covered bed surfaces, you're going to really snuff out all those weed seeds that are still on the surface there. It's just going to get easier. So was it complicated to set up this drip kit?
No.
What does it entail for those that are maybe a little bit intimidated by this leap into drip irrigation?
Well, we bought the all-in-one kit, which had instructions, and you unroll the main tube that you want and you poke holes and attach the little lines from it where you have your beds, and then you cut it you fold the end over.
There's a clip at the end.
Yeah, there's a clip at the end. The trickiest thing was putting on the tapes, the drip line tapes, because they would come off more easily. But if you actually follow the instructions and make them wet and then twist them a little bit, then it stays on.
Okay, so 2 thumbs up for drip irrigation by the sound of it.
Absolutely.
Glad you took the leap. Tell us what it's been like using landscape fabric.
Awesome.
I
Are you
actually prefer mulch. I like landscape fabric, but I prefer mulch. And once you have your plantings in the beds nice and strong, like I think the landscape fabric is great for when stuff isn't growing. Like we put it on for the winter essentially, so it'll stay weed free and warm up nicely in the spring and all of that. And I like it for that. But I think once you've got plants in, I'd like to investigate what it's like to use straw on the beds instead, just because I prefer the organic matter there.
Right, but the thing is, when you put the compost on and use the broad fork to kind of loosen things up, that doesn't work as well when you got like all the ground cover on there.
Yeah.
And then when
Anyway,
you've got like 4 rows of onions, for example, then it's nice to have the landscape fabric because then it prevents all the other things
from
growing.
coming up. Yep. So we like it. I just don't like plastic.
you'd rather look at organic mulch?
I would.
Yeah, I would agree with that in many cases. But yeah, I still find myself using, like this year I knew I planted my onions, which compete horribly with weeds, in a place that had a lot of weed pressure. And pulling out the landscape fabric for those onions, man, it saved me a lot of time. Like I would have been pulling grass by hand. Would I rather look at a weed-free bed that was covered with some landscape fabric, that knowing that I saved myself hours and hours of labor? Yes. And I could accomplish some of that weed control with a thick layer of mulch too, but then that's a lot of labor, gently kind of distributing all of these wood chips around my onions and then raking them apart so I can do the broad forking like James said, and prepping the bed for the next season.
And there's the question of how many trips do I want to do with a trailer to get some mulch? That's also part of the labor and the cost of time and money to buy it. Or, I mean, our city does have some for free that they give out, but it's on the other side of town and our car doesn't pull a trailer. And so I have to arrange that. So there's a few more logistical details to do before I can get more mulch.
Yep. So landscape fabric is very good.
I remember you being excited by the workbook exercises and the structured lessons right from the start because there was so much guidance provided. How do you think those lessons shaped and influenced the decisions that you made in your garden? If you had gone about the same process without that structure, where do you think you would have been veering off in different directions?
I think absolutely the course has convinced us about using bed structure instead of row structure. I mean, obviously you have rows within your bed, but we didn't do that before when we were gardening. It was in some respects similar because we would have bands of rows, but not with walkways between. And so this would not have had walkways in it if we'd done it ourselves. It just would have been a garden plot from one end to the other.
With fresh new weeds waiting to grow every year.
Yeah. So that part is definitely different. I don't know that we would have moved to put in irrigation because it seems like a large expense. And well, we can just throw a sprinkler on there. It'll be fine. But that has made a huge difference in terms of the quality of the produce that we're getting and the quantity of the produce that we're getting.
Mostly it's much more sort of structured and sort of intentional, which I liked.
And it saves a pile of headache.
Yeah, and reduced work in terms of like, how do we lessen the weed load, for example?
Oh my goodness, we always used to have weeds.
Well, yeah, but that's because, I
So
mean,
many
partly
weeds.
of that was the traditional
So
picture.
many large weeds.
Shh. The picture that, you know, we had from our grandmothers where you would have this lovely, fertile, barren black soil with the plant that you wanted growing there neatly spaced, which means that you're hoeing or you're weeding every other day for like 3 hours, which was not sustainable.
It's funny because every time my dad comes over, he says how much his mom would have loved our garden. And he's right, because she would have been astonished at the fact that you can grow a garden that doesn't really grow weeds. Because she was an amazing gardener, but yeah, she weeded all the time.
So there were a few of the highlights from my recent conversation with James and Susan. I'm pleased to report that they finished the season with a few hundred pounds of vegetables that they were able to stow away for the winter months. Can you relate to their desire to grow their own food and vacation too? I know I sure can. It seems like the best of both worlds, right? And now you know that it's possible with the right strategies in place. If you'd like to follow in their footsteps, you can get started today by clicking the link below. And if you're still having trouble imagining how any vegetable garden could possibly be weed-free, then check out this video right here.